Why don't we go ahead and get started? I'll talk
Yeah.
about the syllabus real quick, and then we'll bounce it back and forth. So let me put the syllabus up here. So this is the syllabus for our course, Science and Religion, Anomalies and Miracles, which we taught in 2008 and 2010, if I remember correctly. I am a professor of physics. Michael was a professor of religious studies at Eugene Lang College, the undergraduate division of the New School. And we got this idea to team teach a course together on the intersection of science and religion. We took a very particular angle, which was the angle of picking a topic, and the topic we chose was the reaction to the anomalous, how different intellectual fields and fields of inquiry and ways of knowing deal with unexplained and unexpected facts or observations, occurrences that don't fit into the worldview. So here are the course outcomes as we develop them. Establish and evaluate working definitions of science and religion, to establish and evaluate working definitions of the miraculous and the anomalous, to recognize the particular concerns of science and religion and appreciate their differences, to recognize the historical evolution of the concepts of religion and science, to examine the role of significance in the human interpretation of rare or unusual occurrences, and to describe the similar challenges faced by scientific and religious orthodoxies in the face of singular or unexplained events. Michael, do you want to say something about your recollections of the process of coming up with this course structure, maybe?
At the time that I think we first did it, I was directing the religious studies program, so I was kind of in the heat of figuring out curriculum. And it was also in that kind of really heated period of the new atheism with Richard Dawkins, etc., coming out with some really big popular works that I kept noticing were, circulating or being referenced in my other classes. So what I decided was, and at that time, you remember Eugene Lang was actually encouraging a sort of, cross-disciplinary courses.
Right.
So it occurred to me that there was a perfect opportunity, a perfect kind of cultural moment for our programs to be talking to each other. And my own background is really actually in medieval literature and religion. So I do a lot of work with the lives of the saints. So I'm constantly being, confronted with the problem of the miraculous. And I thought that might be a really interesting go-to or interesting way to, kind of like turn the course by just focusing on that one specific problem. How do you deal with an event which seems to be to kind of challenge the standards of normalness, of normativity?
Right. And at the same time, I think I was just around that time developing a new capstone course for the science department, which was a kind of hybrid philosophy and history of science course called What is Science? One of the things we read in that class was a lot of Thomas Kuhn. And so we're talking about this idea of the anomaly, that science all the time is facing a certain background level of results that don't fit with the theory, and how that is normal. It's not the case that science usually has the answers to all the questions that is posing about the world. And in fact, when that happens, when your theory answers all the questions, science kind of gets stuck. That's kind of where particle physics is right now, right? The standard model answers all the questions that we ask of the experiments and doesn't give us anything new. So particle physicists would love to have an anomalous event. In fact, there's been a couple in the news recently.
I've heard
so
about them.
yeah. So I was coming at the question from the kind of point of view is, what constitutes normal science, and what is the role of kind of the unexpected sort of observation. And even though that was how we framed the course, I don't feel like that was ever really the main focus of the course. I think because the course was team taught, it went off in a lot of different directions.
Right. Well, it's helpful, I think, maybe for those who are listening to this clip, to know that Eugene Lang College, basically the standard format is a seminar.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the key to the seminars, or the joy and the pain of the seminar, is that your students can come up with questions or comments that send the conversation in directions that you could never have imagined. So
Right.
it was kind of great for us because we were sort of learning as we were going, in terms of, hearing things come out of our students' heads and realizing, oh, you know,
And not only was it a seminar, but one of the concessions we had to make to the team teaching approach was to permit a double larger than usual
right.
enrollment. Normally our seminars would be capped at 24. This one was, I think, capped at 30. I think it didn't quite go double. I think it was capped at maybe 36, maybe 40. We didn't quite ever hit that, but it was close. There were more than 30 students in the class at times, which makes it tough to run a purely seminar-based discussion class. But I think we did a pretty good job of it. And so the other thing to stretch is that the course was legitimately team taught, right? You and I were always there all the time. It wasn't a handoff. It wasn't a back and forth. It wasn't a guest lecture situation.
Right, exactly. And I think that was maybe the most, unintentionally, maybe the most successful part of the course, because I remember somebody asking one of our students at the end of the course, how do you guys talk to each other? You guys seem to have this great rapport, and yet you seem to come from things from an entirely different point of view. And that, by the way, also turned up, I noticed, in at least one of the comments in the survey. And
and that's one of the things that I've noticed in team teaching other courses is that, first of all, in this course in particular, I think some of the students came to the course expecting a fight. In other words, they would expect us to be arguing with each other, and you could even, I think, sense a certain amount of segregation of the religious studies students on one side of the classroom and the science majors on the other side of the classroom. And I think that after a couple of weeks, what they realized is that you and I weren't going to fight about anything, because you and I don't really disagree about a whole lot.
No.
And I think that once that realization set in, I think the tone of the course really changed a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
And I've team taught courses with other scientists. We famously did that energy and sustainability course, which was myself and a biologist and a chemist and a mathematician and a science policy person. And one of the things that we realized the students didn't really understand at the end of that course, more than one student said in the student evaluations, it really bothered me when the professors would argue with each other. And we kind of looked at each other and was like, when did we ever argue with them? We never argued with one another. And we finally figured out that when I would ask a question of the biology professor, the students often perceived that as me challenging her authority. It didn't occur to them that a science professor might not know the answer to a science question that's outside of their field. So I think that in the other team taught courses that I did at Lang and Sense, kind of establishing that environment of just intellectual discourse between two professionals is something that the students don't, I think, get modeled for them very often.
Right. And I think it's really valuable, I think, in a lot of ways, and partly precisely because of understanding that, this is going to sound silly, your professor can't know everything. But the more important point is to understand that really getting knowledge, really getting any kind of handle on any field takes a lot of work. And it means, you can't actually, there are obviously always going to be things you just don't know. You have to learn to be not just okay with that, but you have to learn to be willing to trust in the expertise of others.
Right.
One of the things, it's funny because and at the risk of going off on tangent, not like we ever did that in class, but one of the things I think that has changed since we did the course is that now a lot of the discourse in the media, for example, is really focused on this problem of scientific expertise and authority, and the questioning of, the anti-vaccination movement, the skepticism about climate change.
Correct.
And which I find really surprising And one of the things I think that oftentimes gets missed in the conversation, there's this notion that if we just taught the science better, people would understand.
Mhm.
That's, I don't think, the problem. The problem is not a scientific problem. The problem is more of an ethical, and maybe, I hate to, sociological, and if I'm going to go full blast theological, spiritual problem of a lack of trust.
Right.
We no longer have the ability to go, all right, this is somebody who has actually worked on this, and for whatever limitations of knowledge they have, they know more about it than I do.
Right. And there's this, you know, if you read the internet forums and discussions about those kind of topics, which I don't recommend, less often are people challenging the science, and more often are they challenging, oh, you know, academia is just a big money-making scheme, and science is just a big money-making scheme, and they're all out to fool us. And there's this sense of
right.
And it's not quite anti-intellectualism, like you said. It's more like just a lack of faith, a lack of good faith in both the institutions and the people who are part of those institutions.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's, and you know, to be clear, that's the thing that I find truly interesting is that skepticism is now generalized to the point where obviously there's not an institution that's not challenged by it. Right. I think what's interesting
fake news.
Yeah, I think that from the point of view of, you know, where I live intellectually, people often talk about the decline of religious practice amongst youth. I actually see it as being very much the same phenomenon as the lack of trust in scientific research.
Right.
That is, at some level, the two hook up in terms of a skepticism or a cynicism about authority and about
institutions.
And institutions.
Yeah. It's interesting. Do you want to talk about the course content really quickly?
Sure.
Let me put the syllabus back up, and then we'll talk about the survey. Here is the syllabus. So if we take a look at, we'll skip past the grading policies and things like that. Just to take a look at the topics in the left-hand column. We talked about religion and science in terms of practices, which I think was an interesting way to talk about science that maybe students hadn't really thought about before. And
right.
we definitely relied on some Kuhn for that. We talked about attitudes towards scientific realism. You did an introduction about the sort of miraculous historical, I guess, introduction to the nature of miracles, what we mean by that. We talked about the difference between natural and supernatural. And then we really delved into some specifics. You with Augustine, me with Newton. And then at the end of the course, we talked about significance in the context of miracles. And then we had a little unit at the end about the saints and medical miracles. So thinking back to the course, the course was never quite that linear, but we certainly did do all of those things.
Yes, we did. Something miraculously, because frankly, the kinds of twists and turns of the conversation were always a start and fruitful, I think. But man, there are times when I was like, wait, let's get back to the topic.
Yeah, I do remember one of the students actually said in the survey that one of the most memorable lectures is apparently I spent most of one of the days talking about the Force in Star Wars and how George Lucas ruined it by introducing midichlorians in the prequels, which I don't even remember talking about that, but apparently it was memorable enough that 10 years later.
Out having my appendix removed, and just for those of who are listening to this, that was at the end of that student's comment. They said they concluded that you're actually a Jedi. That's actually a religious belief.
I
you know what? I'm kind of thinking, David, they might be right. I mean, you might want to consider that.
I tried to hide my true religious belief system the whole time, but I let the Jedi thing slip. So is there any like bit of that content that you want to talk about in terms of, you know, what to you
Um,
was particularly memorable or important or got the job done or?
you know, I think actually, strange enough, I think the last section on the procedures for canonization and
Hmm.
procedures for evaluating miracles was, for some students, maybe, I don't know. I hoped that had the most impact because so often, at least at the beginning of the course, students, I think, had the idea that religious organizations, religious institutions, and communities welcome these
Right.
strange events. And actually, one of the things that I try to impress upon them is no, as a matter of fact, uh, certainly within the Catholic hierarchy, there's real anxiety about this because
Right.
one never knows what, you know, the person who's reputed to be a saint is going to say, or what the vision of the Virgin Mary is going to, what's going to come out of the mouth of the apparition of the Virgin Mary. And it can be a real headache.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
you know, the kind of uh, desire to have a sort of evaluation and the sorts of mechanisms that get put into place to vet and test claims
Right.
actually comes from almost a desire to prove things wrong.
Right. And
And
that's where I think the parallel to the science actually worked really,
right,
really well, because it really underscores what, you know, what Kuhn and others say about science. When you're doing normal science, the last thing you want is a result that turns out the way that's not what you expected, right? Because it means your theory is wrong in some way, and you want your theories to be right. So there's this tension between science can't progress without unexpected discoveries, but
right,
if you get too many unexpected discoveries, you got to throw everything away and start all over again.
right,
Um, and I think
right.
the other thing we did in that last section is we talked about the kind of scientific process for validating miracles, that the Vatican has medical doctors who look at these cases and say, yes, we do not have an explanation for how this, you know, this person got better. Um,
Right.
I think the students were really surprised, and I think at the time I was really surprised that there is a, you know, there's a scientific investigation happening into
And
those events.
I think the students are quite often surprised too that a number of the doctors involved in those evaluations are not practicing Catholics.
Correct. Right.
And,
Right.
you know,
And they're not putting the rubber stamp on this as a miracle. What they're saying is that you know, this defies, this is anomalous when it comes to a scientific explanation.
you know, I don't know that we actually brought this up, but I've been reading recently that there are now certain illnesses where the Vatican is no longer interested in, if you say that this person was cured miraculously of this particular illness. I think it's specific types of cancer or lymphoma. The Vatican is no longer interested because statistically, apparently, there's a certain incidence
There's
of
enough spontaneous remission that,
that they're like, you know,
right.
um, so
Yeah, that's
so
interesting. And like I said, I think that's something that you know, the students on my side of the aisle, I recall being particularly surprised by, is I guess the right word.
I think that, you know, to a certain extent, again, going back to from what motivated me was this real concern about the kind of lack of nuance,
Yeah.
the way that, you know, I don't even want to talk about debate because even saying debate I think is just simply already sets you up a certain kind of odd uh, set of assumptions. I think for another thing that I think students found a little bit surprising were actually was material that you brought out. I think that a lot of them were kind of surprised to find out that Newton, the father of thermodynamics, was actually doing theology too. You know, um,
I love pulling out that section from the General Scholium where Newton basically says what makes the laws of physics the same everywhere in the universe is that God is omnipresent, right? God is present everywhere in the universe, and God is the person who makes the laws of nature what they are. And it's, you know, the fact that
Right.
Newton's law of gravitation works here and it works in the Andromeda Galaxy is because God is equally present in both of those places. I also love that he takes little jabs at Trinitarianism
Right.
in there as well. Which, if you don't know, you just kind of, physicists don't pay any attention to those.
Right. Exactly.
The fact that Newton refers to God as one like 4 times in 6 sentences,
Right.
you don't really get a sense of what he's up to there.
Right. I mean, this actually brings up another comment. And actually, this was a negative comment, but it's a problem in dealing with this course. I remember, it doesn't turn up in our survey, but in student comments or in the evaluations, I remember reading one student complaining that so much of the material was old. They wanted more modern stuff, and which I found, on the one hand, I bristled because that's my bread and butter. But it's also, I kind of get it. There's a certain way in which students, particularly in a modern American setting, quite often have a pretty weak grasp of history. And too often, in a strange sort of way, in a way very similar to, I think, the way some of them have a bad understanding of science. They want the conclusion. They're not interested in the methodologies.
Right.
And they're not interested in all the data that kind of complicate the story they want to tell. So Newton, who is doing both physics and theology, and overlooking, for example, the fact that Newton is having this fight with Trinitarian theologians, it wouldn't be present in your mind unless you had a sense of what was going on in England at the time.
Yeah, and I think in whatever field you teach in, one is guilty of kind of bypassing those things because there's not enough time to talk about it. But I think that's the reason to do team taught classes like this. I know that there's stuff from the semesters that we taught together that I still, to this day, talk about in my physics class. I don't get out of my unit on Galileo without talking about transubstantiation. Because it always came, and I go on this good 10-minute digression in my physics class about transubstantiation and how it appeared, the idea of atoms seemed to contradict the notion of transubstantiation. And there's a scholar who thinks that that's mostly what Galileo got in trouble for. It wasn't the whole Earth goes around the sun business. It was more the advocating for the existence of atoms, which he does as in the Assayer, which nobody reads anymore. And it's just a little tiny thing in there. And I think that, even if it's only 10 minutes in my physics class, for students to watch this like turn that happens away from why do things fall when you drop them to, the body of Christ. I really throw students for a loop there for a minute, but I love doing it. And it's something that I first did when you and I were talking about.
That those sorts of like moments where you can take from another discipline, where, show that what you are doing actually could be the subject matter that you're doing can suddenly be looked at from an entirely different disciplinary point of view.
Right.
And you get completely interesting results that are actually really relevant that you would just, never think about. I think that really reinforces for students the sort of sense of, it reminds them ideally about the complexity of their own lives. Students, I think, when I come back to thinking about history, one of the things that I keep thinking about, particularly in the present moment, is that history exists largely to explain to ourselves, why it is that we are not all alike, why it is that we differ, why do we disagree? And for students, I think, to suddenly understand that both their particular religious positions and their particular scientific positions are actually the consequence of historical processes, and that if you want to kind of try and escape from historical processes, if that's possible, you at the very least need to understand where you are in the story. Would be helpful, but it requires a lot of work, and I think that that's one of the problems that as educators we all face. I could talk all day. My students have other classes, and
Yeah.
I appreciate
Right.
that, right?
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. Let's pull up the survey real quick
Sure.
and talk about it. So we sent out a survey to the students who, from our class roster, we could come up with all these many years later. Let me see if I can. This was the survey. We sent it out to about 24 students, I think. We didn't get a huge number of responses, and obviously the responses are somewhat self-selecting. But we asked students whether the course had a lasting impact on the way they think about science and religion, on the relationship between science and religion, on their attitudes towards practitioners of science and religion, both before and after the class. We asked them about their recollections of their experience in the course overall and the effectiveness of the team teaching approach. And then we asked them some free response questions at the end of that. And some of the things that were most interesting, like I said, a smallish number of responses that we got were, first of all, every student who responded to the survey said that their recollections of the course and of the team teaching approach were strongly positive. Like I said, even though this is a somewhat self-selected group of students who took the time to respond to the survey, I think that's a pretty good response rate. The other one, Michael, that you mentioned was most interesting was which one?
It had to do with attitude towards practitioners of religion.
Right. Before taking the class, my general attitude towards practitioners of religion was somewhat negative, 2/3, and then the other third split between neutral and strongly positive. And then after the course, 80, oh no, that's science, sorry. Practitioners of religion, strongly positive, 1/3, somewhat positive, 1/3, and then neutral.
I was kind of wondering about that at first because, at one point they said that, if you look closely, you'll see that 2/3 of them said that the course strongly influenced the way they think about religion. And I thought, really, is that true? But if you actually look at the numbers, it does look like 2/3 of them changed their minds to some degree.
Right.
Which left me feeling like I risk being, biased, but I am. My work is done. At least, I'm not asking them to convert, obviously.
Right.
And by the way, that was actually always an issue, to make it clear that I was certainly not invested in getting them to become religious.
Right.
Whatever that word means, which,
right.
We kept talking about how complicated a word it really is.
Right.
But to at least get them past that point where the word itself would kind of trigger an instant bristling.
Yeah.
Which was really happening a lot in a number of my other courses. So that felt like, all right, we've at least gotten some sense of the possibilities of what religiosity or what religion can mean.
Right. And I think for students just to see a discourse that goes beyond the kind of blunt Richard Dawkins-esque and the sort of religion versus science framed as a conflict, as a history of these two opposing forces. I think even that, if the course accomplished that, I think the course accomplished a lot.
Right. What were the things that surprised you, or what did you notice in terms of, for example, students' approach to science? Did you notice any kind of changes, or did they become more sophisticated in their understanding? I'm particularly thinking of the fact that you said earlier that at the same time that we were teaching this, you were also preparing the senior capstone, which is basically on the philosophy of science.
Right.
And so much of what you were doing really was presenting basic philosophy of science.
Yeah, and I think the reason for doing that course as a capstone course and not as an introductory course, you might think, when do you want students to learn philosophy of science? Maybe you want them to learn it when they're freshmen before they learn a bunch of science. I think it was much more instructive to have students learn a bunch of science and then at the end take a step back from what they've learned and say, what does this, really mean? I don't think any of them had really been exposed to any notion of what science is beyond sort of naive realism, that there's a real world out there. Science is about that. Our theories are true. And science is kind of inexorably marching towards some capital T truth. I think just to take a step back and talk about instrumentalism in the context of, Copernicus in 1542, that theory wasn't a great theory in 1542. It contradicted pretty much everything everybody understood about how things move. It didn't do a much better job of explaining where Jupiter was next week, and it required you to throw away boatloads of kind of well-founded philosophical and physical concepts. So the idea of regarding a physical theory as a tool rather than as capital T truth, I think is new to students who have been studying science with the assumption that what they're doing is like I said, just kind of founded in a sort of naive realism about what it means to do science. And I think the strength of doing that for the capstone course was that students in that course knew enough science. I could ask them, give me an example of, some discovery in the history of your field that you're majoring in. That is what Kuhn would call an anomaly. Or give me we read I. Bernard Cohen's Revolution in Science. Look at a revolution in your field and tell me whether it meets his criteria for being revolutionary. So I think students coming at that topic with a certain amount of scientific background knowledge was really, really useful. And so I think in our class, just to even put that discussion out there, to put the philosophy of science out in front of the science in the conversation, I think was really, really something that the students who weren't seniors and maybe didn't have the science background, they'd just taken a couple science courses, or in the case of some of them, no science courses. That was probably something they hadn't seen before. Right.
It's really funny because, there was an analogous situation in the religious studies program. We had a course, they still have a course called Theorizing Religion. And as the curriculum was originally conceived, it happened at the very beginning. It was like a basic course. And at a certain point, we realized that there was a real problem there. Students were going in and taking this course, and they were reading all of these very abstract anthropological and philosophical discussions about religion. They didn't have any data. Right. They had nothing to which they could connect it to. And right. Course made so much better sense when it was made into a 3,000 level course, where students had already taken at least a few religious studies courses and could start connecting these arguments to things that they had read about or experienced themselves.
Right.
It's funny because I remember there was at one of the students in our course, I remember there was this one moment we were talking about scriptural interpretation. And the student basically said, no, we need to have rules about how it can be read before we even start. And I pointed out how ridiculous that is. You don't start out with rules. You start out reading, and then you start seeing problems. And then you have to think, okay, if I've got a problem, how am I going to resolve this? How do I argue my way through the various options? And I think for so many students, it's that is a learning thing. That is something that has to be acquired, is the sense that we're not there to give you answers. We're there to show you the process by which you acquire good questions and maybe, methods to try and approach those questions.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the strength of the team teaching approach, that one of the things that I think the course did very well was to model that search for answers as a discourse rather than, here's Michael with his view of how the world is, and here's Dave with his view of how the world is, and now let's argue about it.
Right.
To see the course framed as a genuine conversation between those two poles, I think was
Right.
something. And I've said this about a couple of different team taught courses that I've taught. Something that could not have happened, certainly with either of us alone in the room. But I think you'd be hard pressed to find any single individual who could do both of those things, equal justice.
I don't, actually, in fact, one of the things
It's 15 hours.
Oh, I'm sorry. My computer has to tell me what time it is. uh, one of the things I recall, in working with you is that you brought to the classroom a rare ability, a rare understanding of the history of the development of physics and astronomy. And that was something that at some level was maybe one of the places where we met, where we had this conversation. So at some level it was, admittedly, Lang was very good about that. Lang, not having necessarily the resources to do a lot of hard science, did a good job, a bang-up job actually, of relating science to larger social issues, to kind of the liberal arts.
Yeah, I'm just for anybody watching this that doesn't know Eugene Lang College at the time, and I think still, they did not have a chemistry department, a biology department, a physics department. They did not give degrees in chemistry, biology, and physics. What they had was a department of interdisciplinary science, and the program was interdisciplinary by nature, both within the sciences and between the sciences and social sciences and social justice and environmental issues, and it was a truly interdisciplinary program. And so a course like this fit nicely within the program, which is, I think, one of the reasons we were sort of allowed to do it for a few years, despite the fact that, one always needs to make a case for team teaching. It's rare that an administration will say, oh, sure, we'll pay 2 professors to stand in a classroom at the same time with the same number of students. But I think courses like this really make a strong case for this, as did the course I did on science and music with Mark Shapiro at the New School also, that you get a exchange of ideas and a view of the intersection between the two fields that a single person working in one of those fields couldn't do by themselves, even if they tried to kind of pay lip service to the other side.
Right. There is something to be said for specialization, but there's something to be said too for the conversations between specialists, that and finding ways for colleges to support that kind of work. It's really crucial, I think. In the broader scale of this course, I think, again, I think we were talking about this earlier, maybe even before we started recording. So much of what is happening, I think, in terms of the socio-political discourse and the kind of problems that we're finding has to do with an inability to move gracefully or easily between different realms of experience, different kinds of different arrangements of information, different ways in which we organize the universe. And you need a model of that. You need to be able to see people, having conversations across those divides, and having, and also exhibiting for themselves an ability to kind of like shift from one reference to another without too much anxiety. Yeah. And I think that's, the strongest argument to be made for liberal arts education. I think that so much of what we ask, or what we are seeing in some ways in the broader society, is the consequence of not giving enough support to those sorts of endeavors. And, I hate to say it, it's not even just civics, it's beyond civics, because civics, it's a deeper sort of sense of how do you talk with people from a broad spectrum of points of view and experience and arrive at some sort of conviviality.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
But that course was one of the most enjoyable experiences I've ever had teaching, I have to say.
It was also one of the, like, I can't think of a whole lot of courses that I had to work harder in either.
Yeah.
Like, I had to read a whole bunch of Augustine, and that's not really something that I would normally do in my everyday life. So,
No, I understand. Yeah. Um, I was a little bit merciless, I think, sometimes with the reading selections, in terms of just not wanting to water anything down.
right.
Um, but in a way, you know, I think maybe if I were to do the course again, I would try to build more scaffolding.
Mm.
So that students, you know, I at the time I was very much of the throw them into the deep end of the water and
We certainly, I mean, pretty much all the readings we gave them were primary source
right.
level readings without a whole lot of preparation, interpretation, background. You know, we let that all evolve out of the discussion afterwards.
Right. And I think that, you know, to a certain extent, we could have saved ourselves some anxiety and saved the students some anxiety had we developed more of a kind of an apparatus, you know, if nothing
Right.
else, to help them understand. For example, help them understand that, you know, when Newton keeps talking about the one God, he's actually talking to somebody out there whose notion of one God is a little bit more complicated.
Right.
But you know, I think that's, you know, I have to say, one of the things that I came away with was a much better understanding of things like the Big Bang, which is again one of these concepts that one of these things that one sees discussed in popular culture, but really the physics of the Big Bang.
Yeah, and not just that, but something that popular writers about science are often really, really lazy about. I'm talking about Stephen Hawking, I'm talking about Brian Greene, I'm talking about Michio Kaku, is they're really, really unclear about what the theory says and what the theory doesn't say.
Right.
And where the theory stops and where the speculation starts.
Right.
And the Big Bang is a particularly egregious example of that, where, you know, we're good down to maybe a nanosecond. Like a nanosecond after the Big Bang, I can look at particle physicists and say, yeah, they pretty much understand what was going on there. But before a picosecond, all bets are off. We have no idea at all what is happening there. And when we pretend to,
right,
we're doing a disservice to the people who are trying to learn what physics says and what physics doesn't.
As a layperson, of course, I have to say that, you know, knowing things down to like up to the first second, pretty damn good. I'm
pretty good.
Yeah,
it is. But what you get, though, is people who will say, well, physicists don't really understand the Big Bang, so I don't believe the Big Bang theory. Right? That we don't understand that first nanosecond. Therefore, I'm going to ignore the 13.5 billion years of extremely effective, extremely predictive, extremely well-confirmed theory that comes after that. It's the same argument that people say, oh, we don't understand exactly how the chemical origin of life happened, so I don't believe in evolution. Right? Nothing about DNA or fossils means anything to me if we don't understand how that first chunk of RNA started replicating. And in some sense, it's a disingenuous argument, but it's an argument that you will see all the time if you hang around the wrong corners of the internet enough.
You know, I think that, you know, it's funny actually, because I remember in parallel to the Big Bang argument, I think I introduced from Augustine, who says, you know, what happened. So basically, somebody asked him, what was God doing before the creation of the universe?
Right.
And he said, God was creating hell for people who ask questions like that.
Right.
By the way, I'm pretty sure he said that with jokingly, but you know, hard to imagine that he had a sense of humor, but actually has a great sense of humor. But I mean, it's interesting because I think that people do have this notion of an all or nothing idea of
Right.
knowledge. And we're really uncomfortable with the incompleteness of our understanding. And, you see that, like you need an illustration, in the last 4 or 5 months with the coronavirus. Just, I experienced it myself, now what have they discovered about this thing? Now what does it do? Is it safe to do this? Is it safe to do that?
Right.
That kind of, we want for very human reasons to have control of the situation. And we think knowledge will give us that control, and therefore when our knowledge is incomplete, we really get anxious. But on the other hand, if we were honest with ourselves, our knowledge is always it's always in flux. And in fact, I'm going to say it's not even always increasing. It's because sometimes
Right.
things go away. We suddenly realize that the thing we were sure about isn't there anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's a place where, science has sort of done itself a disservice by framing it as having all the answers, right?
Right.
And I've been in some arguments recently online. I spend a lot of time on this website called Quora, Quora.
I've spent a little time on Quora too, yeah.
And I like answering questions there, but sometimes you get nonsense, people spreading nonsense there, and people who just want to have arguments there. And I've been having a lot of discussions about this very question, this question of unanswered questions, and this idea that, and trying to convince people that unanswered questions are the lifeblood of science. Like, unanswered questions are the reason anybody becomes a scientist.
Right.
They're not sort of an undesirable thing that we're always trying to get rid of. And there are people that take, we don't know what dark matter is, we don't know what dark energy is, as some kind of indictment of modern cosmology. It's like, no, those are the unanswered questions that are driving modern cosmology.
Right.
Without those unanswered questions, what do you think scientists do all day? And they try to frame it as, scientists not wanting to admit that they don't have all the answers. And I'm like, where did you read about dark energy? You read about it in a magazine that interviewed a scientist, and that's what they like to talk about. They like to talk about the things they don't know the answer to. It's not some kind of big secret that we don't know what dark energy and dark matter are.
I think that there's some really interesting, I think there are a couple of things at play there. Part of it, I think, is the way in which science, and by the way, since I'm not really qualified to talk about science, I'll do my thing. The way in which religion is presented,
Right.
Since I don't really even like using the word religion anymore, I will use the specific experience I have of Catholicism. The way in which Catholicism is presented as the answers out of the catechism, as opposed to the lived experience of, several billion people for the last 2,000 years. But this notion of that scientists present themselves as knowing all the answers, I think partly comes from a school environment in which they were taught that that's what science is, the answer.
Right.
And by the way, that has something to do with claiming a certain sort of cultural capital. If you can pretend to have the answer, then people will, you will get what you want from people. People will bow down to you at some
Right.
level. But clearly it's a misrepresentation of what scientists are doing, what scientists are, and also I think to a certain extent, the ways in which that gets media, which sometimes, and I have to say honestly, quite often in the media that I follow, journalists are pretty scrupulous about saying, look, there is a 99.9% chance that this is right, but you're always, there's always an element of uncertainty. But, I think going back to the course and going back to what was happening in that moment, and which happens periodically, I think, in cultural history, one of the things I noticed was that the arguments about religion and science, let's call it that, quite often are being carried out by people who are not practicing either.
Right.
I remember having this experience. This was actually, I think, while we were teaching the course. I was at a friend's house, and I had an acquaintance of mine was there, who is a rather bitter ex-Catholic, and was talking about how it was a dice game we were playing, and he was saying that as a scientist, he had an advantage because he understood randomness. So he had an advantage with the dice, and I was thinking to myself, first of all, I'm not sure exactly how you're, thinking about calculating probabilities.
Mm.
But I know, if nothing else, that you work as a clerk in the city government, and that you're not you don't practice science. But we try and borrow. Again, and for really good reasons. People would love to be able to borrow on the knowledge or the expertise of other people, and rightly so, because to a large extent, what we know is what other people are telling us, and we're trusting their expertise. But if you don't have also the sense of how that expertise is obtained, if you don't have a sense of how much work goes into again, I'm repeating myself.
No.
And also the extent to which that expertise is, this expert, yes, exists and agrees in many ways with the other experts, but there are these open areas of controversy that,
right,
the experts will fight about amongst themselves, or discuss.
Yeah.
Is important.
Yeah, and one of the things you run into in forums like Quora are people who, for whatever reason, want to enter into that discourse without a sense of what that entails. They think they've got some kind of ammunition to counter the theory of general relativity or whatever, or they think they've got some, improvement on quantum mechanics. And I always say, great, show me your prediction of the anomalous G factor of the electron. Mine is correct to 12 decimal places. Show me what yours is, and then we'll have a conversation about which theory is the best theory. Like, it's not, they're not just throwing words around.
No. And to be fair, or to do the other side. I mean, I hang out in a number of Catholic fora online, and it's interesting to me because, and again, this might be surprising to people who aren't in the thick of the church. You have the people who are basically will cite, the magisterial documents, and then you'll have people like me who are like, yes, but, and then proceed to explain the historical development of the doctrine over the last 2,000 years. And, the dubiousness of some of the assumptions, and the very fact that the doctrine has developed over 2,000 years should lead one to be a little bit reserved about being sure that this is going to be the final, that there's anything like a definitive form of the doctrine.
Right.
But again, that's an historical question, and that's a question of understanding that, or recognizing the ways in which human beings are constantly engaged in this revision,
right,
of knowledge and interpretation.